7-year-old girl whispers to undercover owner in restaurant. He stops cold, and did this. The sizzle of pans and clatter of dishes filled the bustling kitchen of Bella Luna, one of the city's most beloved Italian restaurants. James Davidson, the owner, stood at the counter in his disguise as a line cook, his expensive watch hidden beneath the sleeve of a simple white chef's coat. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been working undercover in his own restaurant, telling the staff he was a new hire named Mike. Something had been bothering him lately, a nagging feeling that his restaurant held secrets he couldn't quite grasp. The dinner rush was winding down, and James found comfort in the rhythmic motion of wiping down the stainless steel counter. The mechanical task helped quiet his mind, which lately had been drifting to memories he'd rather forget. 7 years was a long time, but some wounds refused to heal. A gentle tug at his apron pulled him from his thoughts. Looking down, he found himself face to face with a little girl, no more than 7 years old. She wore a yellow sundress with white flowers, her dark hair neatly braided with matching ribbons. Something about her struck him as oddly familiar, though he couldn't place why. "Mom used to order the special," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the kitchen noise. "You made it for her." James's hand froze mid-wipe, the cleaning cloth suspended in air. The special. Not just any special, she couldn't possibly mean that special. His breath caught in his throat as the words registered. This particular special wasn't on any menu. It had never been. It was a private dish he'd created years ago, a secret recipe he'd perfected for just one customer, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared 7 years ago, leaving behind nothing but questions and an empty chair at her regular table. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. 7 years since the disappearance. A 7-year-old girl. A secret dish that only 2 people in the world should have known about. James glanced around at his staff. Maria, his head waitress, was arranging wine glasses at the bar. Anthony, the sous chef, was prepping vegetables for tomorrow. None of them seemed to notice anything unusual about the little girl or her shocking words. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the cleaning cloth. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he knelt down to the girl's level, trying to keep his voice casual despite the storm of questions brewing in his mind. "The special?" he asked softly, studying her face. "Which special would that be?" The girl glanced over her shoulder at an elderly woman sitting alone in a corner booth, then leaned in closer, as if sharing a precious secret. "The one with the golden sauce and the purple flowers. Mom said it tasted like memories." James felt his knees weaken. The saffron cream sauce. The garnish of fresh violets. Details no one could have known, details he never shared with anyone else. Details that had vanished with her 7 years ago. The restaurant around him seemed to fade away, the present moment blurring with memories he tried so hard to suppress. The regular customer who'd become something more. The private cooking lessons after hours. The special dish he'd created just for her, perfecting it over weeks until it made her smile that particular way. And then, the night she vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but an unfinished meal and a mystery that had haunted him ever since. The coincidences were piling up too high to ignore. 7 years since that night. A 7-year-old girl who knew things she couldn't possibly know. A secret recipe that had died with its only customer. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He looked at the little girl again, really looked at her. The shape of her nose, the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head slightly when she spoke, all eerily familiar. All impossible to ignore. "Who?" he started to ask, his voice catching. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Who is your mom?" But before the girl could answer, a voice called out from the corner booth. "Emma! Come back here, sweetheart. Don't bother the kitchen staff." The girl, Emma, gave him one last look, a look that seemed far too knowing for her 7 years. Then she turned and skipped back to her grandmother's table, leaving James frozen in place, his mind reeling with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Because if this girl was who he thought she was, if she really knew about that special dish, Then everything he thought he knew about that night 7 years ago was wrong. And the truth, whatever it might be, was about to change everything. As he watched Emma rejoin her grandmother, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That somehow, this 7-year-old girl held the key to unlocking a mystery that had haunted his restaurant, and his conscience, for 7 long years. The special dish. The disappearance. The little girl who knew too much. None of it made sense, and yet all of it seemed connected in ways he was only beginning to understand. As he picked up his cleaning cloth again, his hands still shaking slightly, James knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change forever, all because of a whisper from a little girl who shouldn't have known anything about that special dish at all. James's legs felt weighted with lead as he walked from behind the counter, removing his apron with trembling hands. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. After 7 years of questions, of sleepless nights wondering what had happened, he finally had a connection, however strange, to the woman who had vanished without a trace. Kneeling down to the girl's eye level near her grandmother's table, he felt his heart skip a beat. The fluorescent lights of the restaurant caught her eyes in just the right way, and suddenly, he couldn't breathe. Those eyes, he'd know them anywhere. The same unusual shade of amber, flecked with tiny spots of gold that seemed to dance when she smiled. They were her eyes, exactly as he remembered them. "Who's your mom?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper, though he already knew the answer in his heart. The resemblance was uncanny, impossible to ignore now that he was really looking. Emma's small fingers played with the hem of her sundress as she hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted softly, a shadow crossing her young face. "I never met her. Grandma says she's gone." The elderly woman at the table stiffened, her hand tightening around her water glass. She wore a simple blue dress and a pearl necklace that she kept touching nervously, as if drawing comfort from its familiar smoothness. Her eyes, sharp and alert despite her age, watched James with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Was it fear? A chill ran down James's spine as he studied Emma's features more carefully. The shape of her nose, the curve of her cheekbones, even the way she tilted her head slightly when thinking. It was like seeing a ghost, a younger version of the woman who had haunted his dreams for 7 years. Rising slowly, James walked to the kitchen where his staff was busy with their closing duties. "Maria!" he called to his head waitress, trying to keep his voice steady. "That elderly woman in booth 7 with the little girl, have you seen them here before?" Maria glanced over, frowning slightly. "No, first time I've seen them. They came in about an hour ago. The grandmother ordered just a small pasta dish, barely touched it. The little girl's been wandering around, but she seems well behaved enough." He asked Anthony, his sous chef who'd worked at the restaurant for over a decade. Then Carmen, the hostess who seemed to remember every face that passed through their doors. None of them recognized either Emma or her grandmother. Yet something about their presence felt eerily familiar, as if they belonged here, as if they were meant to be here on this particular night. James returned to the booth, this time addressing the grandmother directly. "Ma'am, I apologize for any intrusion, but your granddaughter mentioned something about a special dish. One that's not on our menu." The elderly woman's face paled slightly. "Emma has an active imagination," she said quickly, too quickly. "Children often make up stories. But this isn't made up." James pressed gently. "The dish she described, it was real. I created it 7 years ago, for a regular customer. A woman who..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "A woman who stopped coming to the restaurant suddenly." The grandmother's hands began to shake so badly that she had to set down her water glass. "We should go," she announced abruptly, reaching for her purse. "Emma, sweetheart, it's time to leave." "Please," James said, his voice cracking slightly. "I need to know. Was her name Catherine? Catherine Mitchell?" The glass slipped from the grandmother's trembling fingers, water spilling across the table. Emma quickly grabbed the napkins, dabbing at the spill with practiced efficiency, as if she were used to caring for her grandmother in moments of distress. "How do you know that name?" the older woman whispered, her face now ashen. "You're supposed to be a new cook here. That's what my friend told me when she suggested we come tonight. She said there was a new cook named Mike who made wonderful pasta. James felt his professional facade crumbling. I'm not really a new cook. I'm James Davidson. I own this restaurant. And 7 years ago, Catherine Mitchell came here 3 times a week. She sat at this very booth. I created a special dish just for her, one that was never on the menu. And then one night she vanished. No one knew what happened to her. The police investigated, but... He spread his hands helplessly. Nothing. She was just gone. Emma looked up from cleaning the spilled water, her golden-flecked eyes meeting his with an intensity that seemed far beyond her years. Sometimes, she said softly, when I dream about Mom, she's sitting right here. She's eating something that makes her smile, and she looks so happy. But when I try to talk to her, she can't hear me. She just keeps eating and smiling, like a movie that plays over and over. The grandmother, Catherine's mother, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. We shouldn't have come, she whispered. It's not safe. He might. She caught herself, but James had already heard enough to make his heart race. Who might what? He asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. Please, if you know something about what happened to Catherine. I don't know anything, the grandmother said firmly, though her shaking hands betrayed her. And if you care about this child's safety, you won't ask any more questions. Some things are better left in the past. But as she spoke, Emma's small hand reached out and touched James's arm. The special, she said, her voice taking on that same ethereal quality it had earlier. Mom wants you to make it again. She says it's important. She says it's the key to everything. The restaurant seemed to grow quiet around them, though James knew the usual dinner service sounds continued. It was as if he, Emma, and her grandmother were in their own bubble of time, where the past and present swirled together like ingredients in a complex recipe. The key to what? James asked, but he already knew the answer would change everything. James's mind raced as he looked at Emma, her golden-flecked eyes still holding that uncanny knowledge. He needed to know just how much she really knew about the special dish, about her mother's favorite meal. If there was even a chance this could lead him to the truth about Catherine's disappearance, he had to take it. Emma, he said softly, pulling up a chair to their booth while keeping a respectful distance. You mentioned the special earlier. Could you tell me what was in it? The grandmother started to protest, but Emma was already speaking, her voice taking on an almost melodic quality, as if reciting a beloved story. Mom says it starts with handmade pasta, not regular spaghetti, but the little shell ones that look like tiny boats. James felt his hands begin to tremble. Orecchiette. He'd specifically chosen that pasta shape because Catherine had once mentioned it reminded her of sailing with her father as a child. Go on, he whispered, his throat tight. The sauce is the most important part. Emma continued, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. First, you cook special mushrooms, not the white ones from the store, but the dark ones that grow in the woods. Mom says they smell like autumn rain. Wild porcini mushrooms. James murmured, his professional composure cracking further. He'd specially imported them from Italy, just for this dish. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Then comes the secret spice mix. Mom says that's what made it magical. There's the red stuff that looks like tiny buttons. Pink peppercorns, James supplied, his voice barely audible. And the yellow threads that cost more than gold. Saffron. But the real secret, Emma said, leaning forward conspiratorially, is the flour powder that smells like licorice but isn't licorice. Mom says nobody else would think to put that in pasta. James felt his legs go weak. He had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. Fennel pollen, he whispered. The spice of angels. It was an incredibly rare spice, one he'd sourced from a small family farm in Tuscany. He'd never told anyone about its inclusion in the dish, not even his sous chef. The grandmother's face had gone pale. Emma, sweetheart, how could you possibly know all this? Mom tells me in my dreams, Emma replied simply. She says the special was like tasting memories of home, even though she'd never been to Italy. She says it made her feel safe. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me for a moment." He hurried to his office, his mind whirling. The recipe had never been written down, except once. 7 years ago, he jotted down the ingredients and method on the back of a receipt, intending to make it part of a special Valentine's Day menu. But Catherine had disappeared before that Valentine's Day ever came, and he tucked the receipt away in his records, unable to bear the thought of serving her dish to anyone else. His hands shook as he unlocked the filing cabinet where he kept 7 years' worth of restaurant records. The older files were in the bottom drawer, organized by year and month. He pulled out the stack from 7 years ago, his fingers rifling through paper after paper until there it was. A simple receipt dated October 15th, 7 years ago. Catherine Mitchell's last meal at his restaurant. He turned it over, and his breath caught in his throat. There, in his own handwriting, was the recipe for the special. Every ingredient Emma had just listed was there, including the fennel pollen. But something else caught his eye. At the bottom of the receipt, in handwriting that wasn't his own, was a note he never noticed before. "Thank you for making me feel at home. I'll miss this when I'm gone." See? She'd known. Somehow, Catherine had known she would disappear that night. James returned to the booth, the receipt clutched in his hand. The grandmother was gathering her things, clearly preparing to leave, but she froze when she saw what he was holding. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fear. "It's from Catherine's last night here," James said quietly. "The recipe is written on the back, the same recipe your granddaughter just recited perfectly. A recipe that was never shared with anyone." He placed the receipt on the table, Catherine's handwritten note clearly visible. She knew she was going to disappear that night. Why? The grandmother's hands began to shake so badly that she dropped her purse, its contents spilling across the booth. As James helped her gather her things, he noticed something that made his blood run cold, a business card for a private investigator, dated just last week. Emma, who had been quietly watching this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Mom says there's more. She says you need to look at the books again. Not just the receipts. Something about a payroll record?" James stared at her. The payroll records. He hadn't even thought to check those in 7 years. Why would he? The police had focused on the customers, on Catherine's personal life. Nobody had considered. "She's right," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. The payroll records from that night would show who was working. Every position, every break, every shift change. The grandmother grabbed Emma's hand. "We have to go. Now." Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were hard with fear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. What he'll do if he knows we're asking questions." "Who?" James pressed. "Who are you afraid of?" But the grandmother was already pulling Emma toward the door. The little girl looked back over her shoulder, those familiar eyes meeting James's one last time. "Mom says check October 15th. She called out. "Check who clocked out early but came back later. She says." Emma's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the restaurant. "She says he wasn't supposed to be there that night at all." As they disappeared into the night, James clutched the receipt in his trembling hand. 7 years of questions, and now the answers seemed to be rushing at him all at once. He headed back to his office, his mind racing. The payroll records would tell him who had been working that night, and more importantly, who shouldn't have been there at all. But as he reached for the office door, a shadow fell across the hallway. Someone was already inside, rifling through his files. James's heart pounded as he burst into his office, flipping on the lights. But the shadowy figure had already fled, leaving behind a scattered mess of files across his desk. The payroll records from 7 years ago were strewn about, and several pages appeared to be missing. Someone didn't want him digging into the past. He spent the next hour trying to piece together what remained of the records, but crucial information was gone. However, one detail caught his eye, A shift change notation for October 15th had been crudely erased, leaving a suspicious gap in the schedule. Someone had been trying to hide their presence that night. It took James 3 days to track down Catherine's mother. The business card he'd glimpsed in her purse led him to the private investigator, who reluctantly provided an address after James explained the situation. He found himself standing outside a modest suburban home, its garden meticulously maintained with rows of violet flowers, the same kind he'd used to garnish Catherine's special dish. The grandmother, whose name he now knew was Margaret Mitchell, didn't seem surprised to see him. She stood in her doorway, tension visible in every line of her body. "I wondered how long it would take you to find us," she said quietly. "Come in. Emma's at school, we can talk freely." The living room walls were covered with photos of Catherine, as a child, at her college graduation, and later, holding a newborn Emma. In every photo, her eyes held that same remarkable golden warmth that her daughter had inherited. "You've been investigating her disappearance," James said, noting the cork board partially hidden behind a curtain, covered in notes and newspaper clippings. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured tea into delicate china cups. "For 7 years," she admitted. "The police gave up after 6 months. They said Catherine had simply left, started a new life somewhere. But I knew my daughter. She would never have abandoned Emma." She sat heavily in an armchair, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "That night, October 15th, Catherine called me. She was excited about going to your restaurant. She said she had something important to tell you." Margaret's voice caught. "She never came home." "What did she want to tell me?" James asked, his throat tight. "I don't know. But she'd been nervous in the weeks before. Jumpy. She'd mentioned feeling like someone was watching her at the restaurant, but she wouldn't tell me who." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "The police searched everywhere, interviewed everyone. They said there was no evidence of foul play. But they never found her car, her purse, or her phone. It was like she'd vanished into thin air." James leaned forward. "The night she disappeared, did she say anything unusual during that phone call? Anything about the staff at the restaurant?" Margaret tensed visibly. "She mentioned a waiter who had been paying too much attention to her, making comments about her schedule, asking personal questions. She'd complained to the manager about him, and he'd been fired." She paused, her hands shaking so badly that her tea spilled. "But that night she said she thought she saw him hanging around the restaurant again." "A fired waiter?" James's mind raced. "Who? I don't remember his name. The police interviewed him, but he had an alibi. Said he was at a bar across town." Margaret's voice hardened. "But I never believed it. The way Catherine had described his behavior, it wasn't normal attention. It was obsession." She stood suddenly, walking to a desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a worn leather diary. This was Catherine's. The police returned it after they closed the case. "I've read it so many times, looking for clues." She handed it to James. "The last entry was the morning she disappeared." James opened the diary with trembling hands. The final entry was brief. "Going to James's restaurant tonight. Finally figured it out. The missing receipts, the changed schedules, it all makes sense now. God, I was so stupid not to see it sooner. I have to tell James before it's too late. If anything happens to me, the proof is in the storage room, behind the loose brick. Em won't think to look there." "M?" James whispered. "The waiter's name began with M?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Mark. Or Mike. Something like that. He'd only worked at the restaurant for a few months before Catherine complained about him." She hesitated. "There's something else. Something I never told the police because I thought they'd say I was crazy." She went to the cork board and pulled back the curtain completely. Among the newspaper clippings and notes was a photograph that made James's blood run cold. It showed Catherine sitting at her regular booth in his restaurant, taken from outside through the window. But in the reflection of the glass, barely visible, was a figure watching her from the kitchen. The photo was dated October 14th, the day before she vanished. "Catherine didn't take this picture," Margaret said quietly. "It was mailed to our house 3 days after she disappeared. No note, no explanation. Just this photo showing that someone had been stalking her." Her voice broke. "I think she went to the restaurant that night because she discovered who it was. And they couldn't let her expose them." James stared at the photograph, his mind racing. The figure in the reflection was wearing kitchen whites, but the face was too blurry to make out. Yet something about the stance, the way they were standing. "You said Emma's at school?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, why?" "Because I need to show you something at the restaurant. The storage room Catherine mentioned in her diary. I think I know which brick she was talking about. And I think it's time we found out what she hid there." Margaret grabbed her car keys, but as they headed for the door, her phone buzzed with a text. The color drained from her face as she read it. "What is it?" James asked. "It's from Emma's school," Margaret whispered. "She never arrived this morning. They've been trying to reach me for hours." James felt his heart stop. "Someone knows we're getting close," he said. "And they're sending us a message." Margaret's hands shook as she gripped her keys. "We need to find that brick. Now. Before anyone else does." As they rushed to his car, James couldn't shake the feeling that history was repeating itself. 7 years ago, Catherine had gone to his restaurant with proof of something sinister. She'd never left. Now her daughter was missing too. But this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't let the truth stay buried. James and Margaret raced to the restaurant, their hearts pounding with equal measures of fear and determination. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the empty dining room. James had called ahead to tell his staff to take an early break. Whatever they were about to discover, he didn't want any witnesses. The silence in the restaurant felt oppressive, broken only by their footsteps and the distant hum of refrigeration units. As they approached the storage room door, Margaret gasped. On the floor was a small hair ribbon, pink with white polka dots. "That's Emma's," she whispered, picking it up with trembling hands. "She was wearing it this morning." James tried the door handle, but it was locked. As he fumbled with his keys, Margaret's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, her face going pale as she read the message. "It's a picture of Emma," she said, her voice shaking. "She's sleeping or unconscious. There's a note, like mother, like daughter. Some secrets should stay buried." James finally found the right key, his hands trembling so badly he could barely insert it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. He reached for the switch, but nothing happened. "Power's been cut to this room," he muttered, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating shelves of old supplies and forgotten equipment. A thick layer of dust covered everything, except for a clear path of footprints leading to the back wall. "Someone's been in here recently," Margaret observed, her voice barely a whisper. As they moved deeper into the room, the air grew thick with the musty smell of abandonment and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. James's light beam caught something on the floor near the back wall, a woman's purse, covered in 7 years' worth of dust. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "That's Catherine's bag," she choked out. "The one she was carrying the night she disappeared." Next to the purse lay a faded jacket, its once bright red color dulled by years of darkness. James remembered Catherine wearing it the night she vanished, remembered complimenting her on how it matched the red wine she'd ordered. But it was what they saw on the wall that made their blood run cold. There, exactly as Emma had said, was a brick with a crack that looked like a lightning bolt. And it was slightly loose, protruding just enough to suggest it had been tampered with. "Help me with this," James said, handing his phone to Margaret to hold the light. His fingers found the edges of the brick, and with a grunt of effort he managed to work it free. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside, a USB drive. He breathed, pulling out a small flash drive wrapped in plastic. And something else. His fingers closed around the small notebook, its pages yellow with age. Before they could examine their findings, A noise from the doorway made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching the storage room. "Hide!" James whispered urgently, pushing Margaret behind a tall shelf. He quickly replaced the brick and moved to stand in front of the purse and jacket, trying to block them from view. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from the hallway. "I had a feeling you'd come here today," a familiar voice said. "After your conversation with the girl, it was only a matter of time." James's heart stopped as he recognized the voice. "Michael?" he said incredulously. "My head chef?" Michael stepped into the room, and James could now see he was holding something, a small pink sweater that Emma had been wearing that morning. "Where is she?" Margaret demanded, stepping out from behind the shelf despite James's attempt to keep her hidden. "Safe," Michael replied calmly. "For now. Just like her mother was 7 years ago. At least, until she started asking too many questions." The pieces suddenly fell into place in James's mind. Michael hadn't been the head chef 7 years ago. He'd been a waiter, one who'd been fired for harassing Catherine. He'd reapplied 6 months later under his middle name, with a different social security number. James had never made the connection. "The records," James said, his voice hoarse. "You were the one in my office, destroying the evidence." Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Catherine was clever. She figured out I was stealing from the restaurant, changing records, skimming from the registers. Small amounts spread over time. But she had proof." He gestured to the USB drive in James's hand. "And she was going to tell you." "So you finished her," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I offered her a choice," Michael corrected. "Stay quiet, or disappear." She chose poorly. He pulled something from his pocket, a small revolver that gleamed dully in the phone's light. "And now, history repeats itself. But this time, I'll have 2 loose ends to tie up. 3, counting the girl. You won't get away with this," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The police will." "The police?" Michael laughed. "They've already closed the case. Just like they'll close this one when they find 3 more tragic victims of a restaurant robbery gone wrong. After all, this is a dangerous neighborhood." But as he raised the gun, a new voice cut through the darkness, a child's voice, but somehow different, ethereal. "Behind you," Emma's voice said clearly. Michael spun around, startled, and in that moment, several things happened at once. James lunged forward, tackling Michael to the ground. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. And through the door rushed several police officers, their weapons drawn and flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "FBI! Drop the weapon!" As Michael was wrestled to the ground and handcuffed, James saw Emma standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 FBI agents. She was pale but unhurt, her golden eyes seeming to glow in the darkness. "The nice agents found me at the bus station," she explained calmly. "Mom told me he'd take me there. She said to wait for help." She looked at Michael, who was staring at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Mom's been watching you for a long time. She saw everything." In the chaos that followed, the evidence being catalogued, statements being taken, a full forensics team descending on the storage room, James couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. Whether Emma had truly been guided by her mother's spirit, or had simply been clever enough to escape and find help, one thing was certain: Catherine's 7-year-old secret had finally come to light. And as he watched Emma hugging her grandmother, those familiar golden eyes bright with tears, he could have sworn he felt a presence in the room, warm and grateful, like sunshine after a long storm. The special dish would never be served again, but its purpose had been fulfilled. It had helped a daughter connect with her mother one last time, bringing truth to light and justice to those who deserved it. The following weeks passed in a blur of police investigations, forensic teams, and media coverage. The storage room at Marco's Italian Kitchen became the center of an intensive crime scene investigation, with experts meticulously documenting every detail of the space where Catherine's belongings had lain hidden for 7 years. The USB drive they'd found behind the brick proved to be the key to everything. It contained detailed records of Michael's embezzlement scheme, altered receipts, manipulated inventory logs, and forged payroll records. Catherine, with her background in accounting, had noticed the discrepancies and spent months quietly gathering evidence. The notebook contained her handwritten observations, including dates, times, and specific incidents that proved Michael's guilt beyond any doubt. The forensics team discovered more than just financial evidence in the storage room. Using luminol and advanced detection techniques, they found traces of blood that had seeped into the concrete floor, despite Michael's careful cleaning 7 years ago. DNA testing confirmed it was Catherine's. Detective Sarah Martinez, the lead investigator, sat across from James in his office, her expression grave as she shared the findings. Michael Crawford, or Michael Peterson as he was known back then, had been embezzling from your restaurant for nearly a year before Catherine figured it out. When she confronted him that night, he panicked. But how did he manage to come back? James asked, his voice hoarse. How did none of us recognize him? He was clever, Martinez explained, flipping through her notes. He waited 6 months, changed his appearance, used his middle name and his mother's maiden name. He even had minor plastic surgery to alter his nose and chin. The background check came back clean because he used a stolen identity. But his biggest protection was simply time. Memories fade, people move on. The detective pushed a photograph across the desk. It showed Michael's apartment, where they'd found Emma. One wall was covered with surveillance photos of Catherine, dating back 7 years. More recent photos showed Emma and her grandmother. He'd been watching them for years, making sure his secret stayed buried. When he realized Emma might have some kind of connection to what happened, he knew he had to act. James picked up the photo, his hands trembling. And Emma? How did she really find help? Martinez shifted uncomfortably. According to Emma, she woke up in Michael's apartment and heard, well, she says she heard her mother's voice telling her to look in the desk drawer. She found his wallet there, with his real ID and the bus station locker key. She managed to slip away when he was in the other room and ran to the station. Our agents were already there, thanks to an anonymous tip. Anonymous tip? A woman called it in, Martinez said, checking her notes. The recording is strange. There's a lot of static, but she knew exactly where to find Emma and when Michael would be moving her. The caller ID showed it came from a phone booth that's been out of order for years. James felt a chill run down his spine, remembering Emma's words. Mom's been watching. The evidence against Michael was overwhelming. During interrogation, he finally broke down and confessed to everything. He described how Catherine had discovered his scheme, how she'd confronted him that night in the storage room. The argument had turned violent. Afterward, he'd hidden her body in a remote location, which he finally revealed to investigators. Catherine was finally coming home. The day they laid her to rest, the sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with soft white clouds. The kind of day Catherine had loved, according to her mother. The ceremony was small, but the presence of those gathered felt somehow larger than the crowd itself. Emma stood between James and her grandmother, her small hand clutched in Margaret's. As the minister spoke, she suddenly squeezed their hands and smiled. "Mom's here," she whispered. "She's happy now. The truth is free." Later that evening, James invited Margaret and Emma to the restaurant. He'd closed it to the public, wanting privacy for what he needed to do. In the kitchen, he gathered ingredients he hadn't touched in 7 years. "Emma," he said softly, "would you help me make something special?" Together, they prepared Catherine's dish. Emma knew every step, every measurement, guiding his hands when they shook too much to properly measure the saffron. As the familiar aromas filled the kitchen, James felt a warmth he thought was lost forever. When the dish was ready, he placed it on a table set for 3, garnished with fresh violets just as he had done 7 years ago. Emma took one bite, and tears filled her eyes. "It tastes like her," she whispered. "Like her hugs and her laugh and her love." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed James's hand. "Catherine always said your food was magic. That it could make memories taste like hope." As they shared this final meal, James noticed something extraordinary. The setting sun streaming through the windows cast 3 shadows on the wall, though only 2 people sat at the table with him. The third shadow moved slightly, as if someone were standing, then sitting, then reaching out to touch Emma's hair. Emma smiled, unsurprised. "Mom says thank you," she said quietly. "For keeping her special safe. For helping find the truth. For remembering." James looked at the empty chair where the third shadow originated. "Thank you," he whispered. "For trusting me with your daughter. And for never giving up." A warm breeze swept through the restaurant, though all the windows were closed. It carried the faint scent of violets and something else, a familiar perfume he hadn't smelled in 7 years. The next day, James made a decision. He added a new item to the menu, calling it Catherine's Legacy. The description read simply, "A mother's love, served with violet flowers and hope. In memory of truth that refused to stay buried." Some say that on quiet evenings, when the light hits just right, you can see a woman sitting at table 7. She's wearing a red jacket, and her eyes hold flecks of gold. She never orders, she just smiles, watching over her daughter and the restaurant that finally revealed its secrets. The case file was officially closed, but the story lived on. A story of a mother's love reaching beyond death, of a daughter's unshakable faith, and of a truth that refused to stay hidden. And in a small Italian restaurant, where the scent of violets sometimes mingles with the aroma of fresh-baked bread, a special dish continues to serve up memories, hope, and the kind of magic that only a mother's love can create.